Hi, students. Today we're going to introduce the new reading lesson for Lesson 8. We're going to identify the evidence Rosa Parks brings to support her support segregation that was unjust. I want you to stop and think if you're familiar with that name, Rosa Parks, for a minute. So let's just pause and think. Good job. So you probably have heard about her and her different events that she upheld throughout history. Now we're going to start our new narrative from a book called My Story by Rosa Parks. So let's begin our reading. In 1954, the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not permit laws requiring the separation of African Americans from whites. Before then, however, such laws were very common, especially in the South, when African Americans often had to use separate bathrooms, ride in separate trains, and attend separate schools. This forced separation of the races, which is known as segregation. In theory, the separate African American facilities were supposed to be equal to those provided to whites, but this was hardly ever so. In the case of education, the result of segregation was especially harsh. Many state governments provided no support to African American schools, leading to many African American children receiving very poor educations. The next two personal narratives are by African Americans who grew up during the era of segregation. Rosa Parks' memoir, Rosa Parks' My Story, written by James Haskins, describes her childhood in a rural Alabama where African American children attended a rundown one room schoolhouse where the whites in the area went to very modern school that Alabama paid for. Parks also writes about her efforts to fight segregation, including a very famous act of protest on a public bus. Bertie Bowen, the author of Step by Step, also grew up in the South during segregation. At the age of 13, he moved to Washington, D.C., and despite widespread Sorry, boys and girls. Back where he picked up. At the age of 13, he moved to Washington, D.C., and despite widespread prejudice against African Americans, he received great success as a business owner working for the United States Senate. So, that was a very interesting story, and that's the introduction to our personal narrative about Rosa Parks. So, let's stop and think it for a minute, and you can take time to read it for yourself. Okay, good job, boys and girls. So that was just a short part of the introduction to the narrative that talked about the prejudice and different segregation rules that Rosa Parks had to encounter. Now we're going to read Rosa Parks' My Story, Not Just Another Little Girl. So, another narrative that we're going to read. It begins as it was about six. I was about six when I started school. Sylvester started a year later when he was about five, around 5 years old. We went to the one teacher we went to the one teacher black school in Pine Level and a little frame schoolhouse that was just a short distance from where we lived. It was near our church, the Mount Zion AME church, right in the churchyard. In many places, the church was used as a school, but in Pine Level, we had a separate schoolhouse on the church grounds. We had first grade to sixth grade, and there were about 50 to 60 children in one room. We sat in separate rows by age, and a certain time the larger students would go to read or recite, and then at other times it was the smaller one's turn. My teacher was Miss Sally Hill, and she was very nice. I remember she was a light skinned lady, and she had really large eyes. When the children would tease me or say something to me about how small I would start crying and I would go up and sit with her. And sometimes she would call me and talk with me. was already reading when I started school. My mother taught me at home. She was my first teacher. I don't remember when I first started reading, but I must have been 3 or 4. I was fond of books and I liked to read and I liked to count. I thought it was something great to be able to take a book and sit down and read, or what I thought I was reading. Any books I found where I couldn't read the words, I made up a story about it and talked about the pictures. At school, I liked fairy tales and Mother Goose rhymes. I remember trying to find Little Red Riding Hood because someone had said it was a nice book to read. No matter what Miss Hill gave me to read, I would sit down and read the whole book, not just a page or two, and then I would tell her, I finished this book. And then I started learning to write making my letters, excuse me, boys and girls. I had Miss Hill for only a year. After Miss Beulah McMillan was our teacher. We called her Miss Beulah. She had been a teacher for a long time and had taught my mother when she was a girl. My mother had a picture of the same little school with the students in front of the schoolhouse on the steps, in rows on the steps and down on the ground. The shorter ones and the boys were on their knees and on the ground. My mother never wanted me to show it to anybody because it was a really battered up picture, but I liked it. I used to take my magnifying glass and look at the faces, which were very small. I liked Miss Beulah and I liked school. We had fun there. At recess, the girls would play what we called ring games, like little Sally Walker, sitting in the saucer, raise Sally raise, and ring around the roses. The boys would play ball. I don't think the girls played much ball at school. We used to play at home a little bit. My mother would buy us a ball, and we would have to be careful because pretty soon a rubber ball would be lost. It didn't last too long. We played baseball. I wasn't too active in it because if I tried to be active, I'd fall down and get hurt. I wasn't very good when it came to running sports. Okay, good reading, boys and girls. We're going to pause right here and then come back to discuss what we thought as we were reading that narrative.